Welcome to the Sleepy Mythologist, where myths drift softly through your mind like waves in the night. Tonight, we uncover a story so old and so overlooked it has nearly vanished from memory, the tale of Apollo's forgotten twin, a mysterious figure who once stood beside the god of light, only to disappear into the sea and into silence. But before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Leave a comment and let me know whether you're in a quiet forest in Norway, a bustling city in India, or curled up in bed somewhere far, far away. Your presence is felt here. Now, close your eyes if you wish, and let's drift together into the myth. In the beginning, before the world had fully taken shape and the gods had claimed their thrones upon Mount Olympus, there was a mother, weary and exiled, wandering the earth in search of a safe place to give birth. Her name was Leto, a titaness with golden eyes and a quiet strength, scorned by Hera and hunted across land and sea. The skies grew darker as her labour approached, and the world held its breath. It is well known that she gave birth to the brilliant Apollo, god of the sun, prophecy and music. But what is almost never spoken of, except in rare, crumbling scrolls and half-forgotten chants, is that Leto gave birth to twins that day, not just Apollo, but another. This other child came in the hush between contractions, in the pause between thunder and rain. While Apollo's arrival was a blaze of gold, the kind that breaks through storm clouds and blinds the eye, the second child came in stillness, in a silence so deep that it seemed to draw the breath from the world around him. No cries filled the air, no triumphant shout, only the soft sound of waves lapping against the rocks of Delos, as though the sea itself had welcomed this quiet newborn. The midwives who helped Leto trembled. They looked from one child to the other, from radiant Apollo to the shadowed, silent twin who lay swaddled in salt-streaked linen, his gaze fixed toward the distant horizon. His eyes were strange, not golden like Apollo's, but shifting shades of sea green and pearl. And unlike most infants, he did not squirm or wail. He merely watched, as though he understood something ancient and unspoken. The gods are known to declare themselves early. Some speak with fire, others with flood or thunder. But this child spoke with absence, with that haunting, sacred quiet that falls over a forest before dawn, or the deep space between stars. Leto looked upon both sons with equal love, but the Olympians did not. Whispers spread quickly among the godly hosts. They said that the second child was not right, not whole perhaps, that silence, in a child of divine birth, was a bad omen. They named the firstborn Apollo, meaning destroyer, or he who drives away evil. He was hailed, adored, and prophesied. The second was given no name. Some say Leto whispered one to him in private, pressing her lips to his forehead. But if she did, it was never recorded, never spoken aloud again. What is known, or at least suspected, is that the nameless twin was born with an affinity for still waters, for the quiet beyond the edge of things. As Apollo stretched and basked in light, his brother would stare into the sea, as if something within it whispered back. Among the ancient poets there are hints. One fragment, recovered from a ruined temple on a forgotten isle, says simply, "Twin born of silence, child of foam, walked the shore but belonged to none, gave no word nor ever cried, but heard the music others hide." From the very first moment of his life, the forgotten twin was different, not unloved, but unnerving, a child of the threshold, who existed between realms, not sun, not moon, not land, not sea, neither fully here nor fully gone, and so began a life mostly unwritten, a life pushed aside by louder stories and brighter gods. Yet, if one listens closely, especially near the sea at twilight, it is said you can still hear the breath of that ancient child. A breath not of wind or wave, but of something older, something waiting. And unlike the stories we know, he did not grow up beside his brother. He was not raised in the temples. He vanished quietly, before the world had even fully realized he was there. Delos was not always an island. Once it was a drifting rock, aimless and unanchored, cursed by Hera herself to offer no refuge to the suffering Leto. The goddess had been cast out, hounded for carrying Zeus's children, her every step shadowed by rejection. She roamed across lands scorched by divine jealousy, across deserts and forests that refused her, until she found a place that was nowhere, an island that floated freely upon the Aegean Sea, untethered to any law, god, or nation, a place forgotten by Olympus, and perhaps even by the fates. When Leto arrived, the rock trembled beneath her feet, sensing the weight of something sacred and painful. The earth itself groaned with anticipation, and the winds that once pushed Delos adrift suddenly died away. The island, it seemed, had been waiting not just for a birth, but for something that would anchor it in myth and memory. The birth of Apollo on Delos has been celebrated in hymns for centuries. The sky blazed with light. Swans circled overhead in solemn procession. Palm trees bloomed out of season, their fronds catching the golden winds. Every detail was etched into legend, into song, into the very stones of the island. Pilgrims later came from every corner of the ancient world to stand upon the spot where the god of light had drawn his first breath. But no one tells of the shadows that accompanied that radiance. The other child, the one born in the lull between divine fanfare and mythic memory. As Leto laboured on the trembling earth, Delos began to change. The moment the second twin emerged, silent, motionless, with eyes like still tide pools, the waters around the island stilled completely. Even the fish stopped swimming, not out of fear, but awe. Time for a breathless instant seemed to pause. Unlike Apollo's arrival, no celestial bodies moved to announce this child. No constellation appeared, no songs were sung, but the sea noticed. Some say the tide withdrew in reverence, forming a ring of glistening sand around the island, as if offering the child a pathway home. Others whispered that dolphins were seen just offshore, circling slowly in silence, their eyes reflecting something human. Delos too began to listen. The stones warmed beneath the infant's body, not with fire, but with memory. Something ancient stirred beneath the earth, older than the Olympians, older than the Titans. This was not a birth meant for Olympus, it was a return. The priests and midwives attending Leto felt uneasy. There were no cries to reassure them, no wailing to signal life. Just a quiet breath and the sensation of being watched, not by a child, but by something already aware. The twins' gaze was not curious, like a newborn's, but contemplative, as if he remembered something he was not supposed to. They laid him beside Apollo, hoping the warmth of the sun god might awaken something within the silent one. But instead, the second child turned his face away, toward the sound of waves crashing gently beyond the shore. From that day on, Delos was never the same. Though it would be remembered for Apollo's glorious birth, some who visited claimed they felt an invisible presence beneath the surface. Certain sailors refused to dock their boats at night, speaking of strange lights under the water and soft humming noises that echoed through the hulls. Children born on the island sometimes spoke of a man with pearl-coloured eyes who appeared in dreams and said nothing, only pointed towards the sea. There were stories, of course, never sanctioned by the temples, that Delos had once been a gateway between worlds, that the forgotten twin was not just a god denied worship, but a keeper of the in-between. His connection to the island ran deeper than Apollo's. Where Apollo made Delos famous, the other twin made it sacred. But sacred things are often unsettling. They do not shine, they resonate. They do not declare, they whisper. And so, as time passed, the twins' memory faded. Delos was anchored in history, Apollo in glory, and the silent child in forgetting. Yet even now, if you walk the shores of Delos alone at dusk, you might notice how the waves seem to pause at your feet, how the air hushes, as if something unseen is passing by. Something born there, but not meant to stay. Something that did not rise with the sun, but fell gently into the sea. He was not like other children, not even like other gods. From the very beginning, the twin brother of Apollo remained cloaked in a mystery so deep that even the wisest seers could not name it. He was a presence more than a person, a being that existed not in the way one walks and talks and is celebrated, but in the way a pause exists between two notes of music, subtle, invisible, and yet utterly essential. When the silent twin opened his eyes, he did not wail, did not flinch. His chest rose and fell with the gentlest rhythm, and those present swore the air itself grew still around him. Even the birds ceased their calls. There was no divine laughter, no proclamation from Mount Olympus, no booming voice from the heavens welcoming this child, only stillness. Apollo, from the moment of his first cry, reached toward the sky. His fists curled as though grasping for sunlight, and his cries were strong, vibrant. the kind that made mortals weep and gods smile. But the second twin, the one who would never be named, turned not outward, but inward. His gaze did not seek attention, but understanding. Nurses brought him soft blankets woven from divine wool, gifts meant to warm and comfort, but he pushed them aside gently, preferring the coolness of the open air. He was always listening, not to the voices around him, but to something beneath them, a deeper frequency, the tide moving beneath rock, the echo of silence in a mountain's heart, the subtle creak of stars turning in the night sky. Those who came to see the twins in their infancy often left with a strange feeling after encountering the Silent One. They felt as though they had forgotten something important, a dream perhaps, or a name once spoken in childhood. They would furrow their brows and shake their heads, unable to place the feeling, but deeply unsettled all the same. It was not fear he inspired, but a kind of unsettling familiarity, like standing in front of a mirror and seeing not your reflection, but something else entirely. Apollo grew loud and bold with every passing day. He laughed early, his voice ringing like harp strings across the stone courtyards of Delos. He chased light, learned quickly to walk, and pointed his fingers at the sun as though it were his rightful throne. Songs were composed in his honour. Offerings were made to his radiant beauty and cunning mind. Priests declared him the embodiment of clarity, of truth, of order. But the other twin remained quiet. He spoke no words, not as an infant, nor as a child. And yet those who stood near him often claimed they heard things they could not explain. Not voices exactly, but impressions, thoughts that weren't theirs, visions that vanished the moment they tried to describe them. One shepherd who once cradled the child swore he saw a great sea open beneath his feet, not in the world, but within his own soul. Another woman claimed she dreamed of her long-dead grandmother the night after touching the child's hand, and the old woman told her secret she had no way of knowing. The twin did not respond to his name because none had been given to him. At first, Leto tried to coax words from him, calling him Child of the Tides, My Little Stillness, or simply My Second Light. But he answered to none of these. His mind, it seemed, was already elsewhere, attuned not to words, but to something much older, much deeper. He did not sleep as other infants did. While Apollo slumbered in warmth and dreamt of battles and glory, the silent twin stayed awake for hours, staring at the moon's reflection in the sea. Once a servant found him sitting at the very edge of the shoreline, the tide gently lapping at his feet, completely unbothered by the cold or the dark. When she tried to lift him, she claimed she felt a strange resistance, not physical, but spiritual, as if the air around him did not want him disturbed. There were rumours that even the animals responded to him, not with affection, the way creatures are drawn to radiant beings, but with reverence. Owls would perch silently near his chambers, cats would sit and stare unmoving for hours, dolphins were seen leaping near the shores whenever he wandered close to the water. And in one peculiar tale, a sea turtle emerged from the waves and rested beside him for an entire night, unmoving, as if they were simply being together. Two old souls side by side. Priests and scholars began to question his nature. Was he divine? Was he human? Was he something else entirely? A bridge between realms? A forgotten consequence of the union between Zeus and Leto? Some said he was a shadow born from Apollo's light, an inevitable twin, created not for worship but for balance. Others whispered more ominous things, that he had no name because he was never meant to be remembered, that he had slipped through the cracks of fate itself. And yet, Leto loved him. She never feared him. When she held him close, she did not expect him to speak, to dazzle, to shine. She simply let him be. She understood, perhaps better than any god, that some things in life are not meant to be known. They are meant to be felt, like the hush before dawn or the ache of a memory you can't quite place. He was the silent twin, the watcher, the one who did not cry, not because he could not, but because he did not need to. His message was not for the ears, it was for the soul. And though the world would soon forget him, and the myths would pass him by, he had already begun to write his story, not in temples or songs, but in the quiet spaces between the tides. Long before the twin brothers were born, when the world was still young, and the gods were prone to speaking their thoughts aloud, a prophecy was spoken. It was not chanted in the temples, nor declared before kings. It was whispered, barely audible, in the breathless hush of a cave hidden deep within the cliffs of a forgotten island. Only the most ancient nymphs, those who had watched the stars form their patterns and the mountains lift from the sea, remembered it. They said, "The child of stillness will drown in time, but never in death." At the time, no one understood what it meant. The seers argued over its meaning, scrolls were written and then discarded. The gods themselves ignored it, for they assumed, as they often did, that all true prophecy would concern them directly, and what threat or wisdom could come from a nameless silence. But the words lingered, and when Leto gave birth to twin sons, and one of them remained as still as the grave, as quiet as moonlight on the deep water, a few old souls remembered. There was a strange rhythm to the silent twin's life. Time seemed to move differently around him. Apollo, his brother, was full of urgency, growing quickly, claiming temples, speaking truths that cut like sunlight through shadow. He embodied movement, action, and radiance. The world responded to him, because he called it to attention. But the other child, did not call. He listened, and in doing so he absorbed the very texture of time. He could sit by a stream for hours, watching a single leaf spin gently in the current, as if each rotation whispered secrets lost to mortals. He would place his hand upon the stones and close his eyes, as if reading the memories trapped within them. Time, it seemed, passed through him, not over or around, but through, like wind moving through tall grass, unseen but not unfelt. As he grew, there were moments when he would disappear, not physically, but perceptually. One might walk past him without noticing, as if he were part of the scenery, a trick of the light, a shadow mistaken for nothing more than absence. And then, suddenly, he would be there, looking directly at you with those sea-coloured eyes, as though he had been watching the entire time. It was then that the whispers returned. The prophecy was recalled, not with urgency, but with unease. "He will drown in time, Furious," they said, and priests wondered if this meant he would vanish, forgotten by history, a god who would not leave a mark, but instead be erased by the steady current of years. But others, more attuned to deeper truths, interpreted it differently. Time would not wash him away like it does mortals and memory. No, he would drown within it. He would sink beneath the surface of days and years, not because he was weak, but because he could hear something in the depths that others could not. To drown in time was to fall into memory itself, to slip past the world of form and into the ever-widening ocean of eternity. It was not a death, but a transformation, from person to myth, from myth to whisper, from whisper to presence. And yet this fate was not chosen. It was felt, like a gentle pull beneath the waves, a calling that could not be ignored. Some said he would vanish entirely. Others believed he would remain, unseen, but always near, guiding those who listened to the silence rather than the noise. For silence, after all, is not the absence of sound, it is the presence of something deeper. His mother Leto once confided in a trusted servant that her second son would never belong to the world of gods or men. "He is not made of the sun or the earth," she said, "but of the space between them." The fates themselves, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, were rumoured to have debated his thread. One would spin, the second would measure, but when it came time to cut, they hesitated. Could you cut a thread that wasn't woven, but simply was? A thread that loops not forward, but inward? Eventually the twin began to change in ways even the gods did not understand. Time no longer marked him. He did not grow in the same way as Apollo. His features remained youthful but ancient. His gaze deepened. His silences stretched longer. And at last, those around him stopped asking questions. It became easier not to speak of him at all. The temples told stories of Apollo's great victories, his prophecies, his sun chariot crossing the sky. No songs were written for the twin, no statues raised. His story was never denied, just not told. And in that forgetting, the prophecy came true. He drowned in time, not with thrashing or cries for help, but willingly, gently, like slipping into a warm, endless sea. But he did not die, for what dies is remembered briefly and buried. He became something else, tied beneath time, a presence felt but not named, an echo in dreams and sea caves. And sometimes when time feels strange, when a moment stretches too long or passes too quickly, it is said that he is near, not speaking, just watching, always just watching. He would often wander away from the others, barefoot and silent, toward the edge of the island where the cliffs leaned over the sea. No one knew how he always found his way there, especially when so young. There were no paths, no roads, only rough terrain and dense thickets of salt-twisted brush. But somehow he moved through them like mist moves through trees, untouched, untroubled, as if the island itself parted for him. Those who watched him noticed a pattern. While Apollo basked in the sun, danced in meadows, and trained with golden weapons forged by the gods, his brother moved only when the tide did. His rhythm was not solar but lunar, subtle, cyclical, inward. At times he could be found standing ankle-deep in the sea, motionless for hours, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He never played like other children. He never sang, but he was listening, always listening. To what no one could say. There was something in his stillness that unsettled even the oldest among the island's dwellers. It wasn't eerie or threatening, but it felt ancient, like something that had always been there, long before temples were built, long before the first gods took their seats on Olympus. A silence that seemed to know you, not in the way people know one another, but the way the sea knows the shape of the shore, constant, inevitable, and indifferent. And the sea, oh, how it responded to him. Fishermen began to whisper stories among themselves. They swore that on the mornings after he visited the shore, the fish were more plentiful than ever before, as if the ocean had opened itself in offering. Others said that dolphins would follow his gaze, leaping where he looked, spiraling and playing only when he watched. Some even believed that when his feet touched the water, the waves softened, and the currents grew still, like a wild thing calming under the hand of one it recognizes. There was one story, nearly forgotten now, of a sailor whose boat had been caught in a terrible storm near Delos. The sky had gone black, and the winds had howled like furies. But then, amidst the crashing waves, he saw a child, standing atop a rock, unmoving, his hair soaked and streaming like kelp, his eyes reflecting the lightning. The sailor remembered no words, no gesture, only that as soon as their eyes met, the sea calmed. Not suddenly, but slowly, like an angered god taking a deep breath. When the sailor reached the shore, delirious and grateful, he tried to find the boy again, but the islanders only gave him puzzled glances. No child was out there, they said, not during a storm like that. But he knew what he had seen, or at least what had seen him. The twins' affinity for the ocean deepened with time. He would whisper to the waves, though no one ever heard him speak aloud. He would place shells to his ear, then sit still for hours, as though in conversation with the hollow sound within. Occasionally he would leave small offerings, a stone, a feather, a carved piece of driftwood. He never took anything from the sea, never a fish, never a shell, he gave, and the sea gave back in mysteries. There were times when those who followed him at a distance saw shapes moving beneath the waves, not dolphins or whales, but forms more ancient and less easily named. One priest swore he saw something vast circle the boy beneath the water, something large enough to darken the turquoise shallows. But the child did not flinch. He simply stood, arms at his sides, as if receiving a message meant only for him. That same priest later said in hushed tones, "He is not visiting the sea, he is remembering it." There is a belief, held only by a few mystics and forgotten philosophers, that some souls do not come from above, not from Olympus, not from the stars, but from below, from the depths. These are the souls of stillness and deep knowing, souls shaped by pressure and silence. They do not speak because their language is not sound. They do not move quickly because time means something different to them. They arrive in this world as strangers, carrying the weight of tides, the pull of ancient currents. Such a soul, they say, was the twin of Apollo. He was not fascinated by the sea, he was part of it. Not as a child of Poseidon, not as a god of water or salt or storm, but as a presence that echoed the ocean's most elusive quality, its ability to be everywhere and nowhere, beautiful and terrifying, eternal and ever-changing. As he grew older, he spent more and more time alone by the water. Leto worried, of course, but never stopped him. She knew instinctively that her second son was being called, not by madness or isolation, but by remembrance. He was not retreating from the world. He was following a thread, invisible, ancient, back to something forgotten by even the gods. He would sit upon the highest cliffs during stormy nights, the wind screaming through his hair, the sea exploding against the rocks below. Others would flee from such tempests, but he sat calm, eyes closed, lips moving ever so slightly, as if singing, not to the storm but with it. Some began to call him the eyes of the sea, not because he watched it, but because it watched through him. And when he did look out across the waves, there was always the sense that he was not seeing the surface, not even what lay below, but something beyond. Something that had no form, no shape, no name. Something so vast and so sainted it could only be understood by one who had silence in his very bones. There were no poems written about this, no hymns sung in marble temples, because the people did not understand and the gods did not care to. But the sea knew, and every time he stood at its edge it remembered him as one of its own. Apollo was the god of light, of clarity, of order. He was the golden child of Olympus, the bringer of harmony, the embodiment of divine brilliance. Wherever he went, the world responded. Flowers bloomed in his footsteps, lyres played sweeter in his hands. The sun itself seemed to pause and shine more gently when it kissed his skin. From his earliest days, he dazzled all who saw him, or saw, mortals and immortals alike, and it was no surprise that temples were raised in his honour before he had even learned to speak in full sentences. His laughter rang out like morning bird song, and his gaze held the sharpness of prophecy. In the company of the gods, Apollo was praised and adored. His beauty was without flaw, his mind unmatched in its precision. He was loved for his music, feared for his arrows, and respected for his wisdom. And yet, for all his glory, there was one presence that disturbed him, one figure who stood outside the sphere of his radiance and refused to reflect his light. His twin, the forgotten brother, the silent one, was never jealous, never envious. He never challenged Apollo, never competed, never even looked at him with resentment. He simply existed alongside him like a shadow beside a flame. But this very lack of rivalry, this eerie stillness, unsettled Apollo more than any open threat ever could. Apollo was accustomed to reaction. He was a god who provoked movement. Hearts raced, minds opened, limbs danced. But the silent twin did not respond. Not with awe, not with fear, not even with curiosity. It was as though Apollo's brilliance passed through him without resistance, without landing, as if his light cast no shadow on the twin at all. And this, over time, stirred something unfamiliar in the god of reason. Discomfort. It began with small things, when Apollo told a joke or laughed, except his brother, who simply watched. When Apollo recited a flawless verse, the muses themselves sighed with joy, but the twin only tilted his head slightly, as if hearing something beneath the words. When Apollo performed music that moved even Artemis to tears, the silent brother remained unmoved, as though the sound reminded him of something older, something deeper that had long since faded. At first, Apollo ignored it. Why should he care for the opinion of one who never spoke, who made no claims, who sought no glory? But that was precisely what made the feeling grow. The twin's indifference was not dismissive, it was complete. He seemed to live in a world that Apollo's light did not touch. And that was a kind of power Apollo did not understand. As time passed, Apollo began to feel a quiet irritation. He would glance sideways at his brother during feasts or the ceremonies, wondering what lay behind those still sea-coloured eyes. The twin never blinked in awe, never smiled in reverence, never mirrored the joy others offered to Apollo. He watched, he listened, and Apollo began to suspect that he knew something that no god, no prophet, no seer had ever told him. There were moments, fleeting, rare, when Apollo's confidence would waver, when a prophecy came to him in dreams that he could not interpret, when the notes of his lyre fell into dissonance without warning. In those moments he would glance at his brother, who stood nearby like a tide that had always been there, and Apollo would wonder, does he see something I do not? This question gnawed at him. Apollo, whose truth was unquestionable. Apollo, who pierced all illusions with his sight. Apollo, whose prophecies shook the very thrones of kings, now found himself disturbed by the silence of a brother who never challenged him, but never submitted to him either. Some say it was not hatred that grew in Apollo's heart, but fear. Because his twin was not chaotic or wild, he was not driven by vengeance or ambition. He simply was, serene, immovable, unreachable. He did not demand worship or devotion. He needed nothing, and that made him more dangerous than any enemy. For the gods understood desire. They understood anger, rivalry, lust, hunger for power. These things were familiar, predictable, but this brother had no desire, no visible motive. His silence was not weakness. It was a depth, the kind that makes even gods uneasy. And so Apollo began to pull away. He crafted more elaborate songs, sought grander temples, stood more often in public view. He demanded clearer boundaries. His twin was not invited to rituals, his name was not spoken. When mortals asked about the second child, priests would shake their heads and murmur of mistaken rumours. There was only one, they would say, only Apollo. But the sea never forgot, and deep inside Apollo knew the truth. He knew that no matter how far he extended his light, there was a place it could not reach, a realm of stillness he could not illuminate, nor understand. Some claim that Apollo once confronted his brother on the shore at dusk, when the sky was filled with gold and the sea mirrored it like molten fire. He asked the twin, not angrily but with trembling curiosity, "Why do you look where I do not shine?" And the twin, still silent, turned and walked into the water, the waves parting softly before him. Apollo never spoke of it again, but ever since that day he became more careful with his words, more guarded in his prophecies, as if some part of him now doubted his own omniscience, not because of error, but because he had glimpsed a truth that was beyond words, beyond light, beyond comprehension. He had glimpsed his brother, the one who did not need to challenge him, the one who made no claims and sought no throne, and yet simply by existing reminded Apollo that even the brightest god casts no light beneath the sea. They were born together, two souls emerging from the same divine mother, on the same sacred island in the same moment of cosmic significance. Yet they could not have been more different. One burned like a star, the other moved like a tide. Apollo, golden-haired and quick of tongue, embodied all that was visible, audible, knowable. He wielded the lyre like a sword, commanding melodies that stirred mortals to dance, to weep, to dream of things they had no words for. But the other twin, the forgotten one, held no instrument, made no sound. And yet he understood music in a way that Apollo never could. It was not music made with strings or reeds or drums. It was not heard in concert halls or sung by trained voices. It was a different kind of music, the music of the deep. It began with a strange sensitivity. Even as a small child, the silent twin would turn his head slightly when no sound could be heard by others. He would sit on the stone cliffs of Delos with his bare feet dangling over the water, his eyes half closed, his body swaying just faintly, not to the rhythm of wind or waves, but to something more distant, something beneath. He would press his hand against rocks or lean against ancient trees and become very still as though waiting. At first, the others believed he was simply staring into space, lost in some unfathomable thought. But those who watched him closely noticed that his breathing would slow, his heartbeat would change, and the world around him would seem to enter a strange harmony. Birds would stop chirping, leaves would cease to rustle, even the waves would seem to sync with his breath. It was as if he was tuning himself to a hidden melody, a frequency buried so deep within nature that only the most silent hearts could hear it. Apollo, ever radiant and exuberant, was puzzled by this. To him, music was mastery, the ability to produce perfect tones, to construct harmony from chaos. His lyre was an extension of his brilliance, a tool of transformation. When he played, the world responded with awe, and rightly so. But his brother never attempted to play, never sang, never tapped a rhythm on a drum or hummed a tune, and yet, the moment he stepped into a space, the air changed. There is a legend told only in fragments, found in a crumbling scroll unearthed from a long-buried cave. It tells of a moment when Apollo, curious and frustrated, confronted his brother during a quiet evening on the island. He demanded, "If you know music, then show me, play something. Let the gods judge who holds the truest song." But the twin only looked at him with calm eyes and said nothing. Instead, he turned toward the sea. He walked down to the shoreline and placed his hand on the surface of the water. The waves responded, not with noise but with resonance. A gentle thrum pulsed through the sand, the wind stilled, and from deep beneath the sea a soundless chord seemed to rise, a kind of presence that wrapped around the body but never touched the ear. Apollo stood silent, For the first time in his immortal life, he felt a song that did not come from his strings or his voice, but from something older than Olympus. A song that was not sung but remembered, not composed but discovered. He felt it in his bones, not in his mind. It was the music of the world before sound. The silent twin turned back and walked away, leaving Apollo with his lyre untouched. After that, the god of music never challenged his brother again. The music of the deep was not for performance. It was not meant to be heard by crowds or enshrined in temples. It was the pulse of nature before language. The sigh of tectonic plates shifting beneath the crust of the earth. The slow bloom of coral in darkness. The murmur of stars. The rhythm of grief and birth and stillness that lives in the space between moments. And only the twin, quiet, invisible, forgotten, could hear it. Some believed he could hear memory itself, not memories of events, but the memory of the earth, of existence, as though everything that had ever happened, every sorrow, every joy, every act of love or cruelty, left behind a faint note in the great endless song of being. And he, the twin, could gather these notes simply by listening, simply by being still. When he wandered the beaches of Delos, creatures would rise to meet him. Seals would bask nearby without fear. Crabs would scatter, then return. Even the smallest fish seemed to follow his movements. But he did not smile or wave or speak to them. He simply walked among them as one who belonged, not as their master, but as their kin. There are rare stories from sailors who crossed his path far from the island, men adrift on endless water who heard a strange hum rising from the deep, not a sound, but a presence, a pressure that wrapped itself around the soul like a song you forgot you knew. And just as they feared they would go mad from the silence, they would glimpse a figure standing atop the water far off in the distance, staring down into the depths. All was silent, all was listening. One ship's captain, grizzled and hardened by years at sea, claimed he once fell into a trance and heard the ocean weeping, not for sorrow, but in relief, as if someone had finally returned. When he awoke, he wept for reasons he could not explain. He never sailed again. None of these tales were told in temples. None were written in the polished scrolls of the philosophers. They lived in taverns and on the lips of old mariners who had seen things they were not meant to understand. The gods who live in the heights are easy to praise. Their glory is visible, their miracles loud. But the forgotten twin, the one who heard the deep, never needed praise. He was not a god of performance, he was a god of memory, of all amphirs, of the music that came before the world had ears to hear it. And somewhere even now, beneath the waves or buried deep within us, that music still plays. Not for applause, not for power, but simply because it must. The forgetting did not happen all at once. There was no decree, no shared moment of erasure, no dramatic fall from grace. It was quieter than that and slower, like a tide that recedes inch by inch, until the shoreline is left bare and empty, and no one remembers how far the water once reached. At first, the twin was simply spoken of less. When priests recited hymns to honour the birth of Apollo, they began omitting the mention of his brother. Not out of malice, but convenience. The twin was difficult to describe, and even more difficult to explain. He had no temple, no domain, no name. He had made no proclamations, won no contests, performed no miracles. He had simply been there, moving in the margins, unsettling those who noticed him, and haunting those who forgot. In the great festivals of Delos, Apollo was celebrated with song and dance. Statues of the golden god were adorned with garlands and offerings. Poets competed to see who could compose the most beautiful verse in his honour, but none sang of the twin who had walked silently along the shore. None sculpted his form or burned incense in his memory, and so in time it was as though he had never existed. Except he had. There were still a few who remembered. An old servant who had once rocked him to sleep and dreamt of waves lapping at her ankles every night for the rest of her life. A shepherd who, as a boy, had watched him touch a dying bird and heard, not with his ears but his heart, a single resonant note that echoed in the silence that followed. An elderly sailor who could no longer recall his children's names, but who remembered with perfect clarity the day he had seen a boy with sea-coloured eyes walking across the rocks just as the mist parted and his ship avoided the reef. But these memories were not enough. Not in the face of Apollo's brilliance, not against the tide of stories that favoured light over shadow, speech over silence, action over stillness. Even Leto, the mother of both, found herself caught between love and duty. She loved her silent son, there could be no doubt. She had held him against her chest on the day of his birth and whispered to him names that no one else ever heard. But as the years passed and the worship of Apollo grew, Leto found herself forced to speak of one child more than the other. She could not openly defend a son who had chosen to live outside the reach of Olympus, beyond the gaze of the gods, and so, with quiet sorrow, she allowed his memory to slip away from the world, even as it remained carved into the deepest parts of her own soul. There were rumours, whispered only in secret, that some gods had grown uneasy in the presence of the twin, that his silence made them feel exposed, as though he could see what even prophecy could not. He did not offer flattery, nor did he ask for favour. He seemed immune to both pride and persuasion, and that made him dangerous in a way few could tolerate. Zeus, it is said, once looked upon his silent son and saw not rebellion, but removal. A soul that had chosen to drift away from the current of divine power, unbound by ambition, unshaped by desire. To a god like Zeus, whose existence depended on dominance and devotion, this was deeply disturbing. It was as if the twin had seen through the entire drama of Olympus and found it hollow. Some believe it was not Apollo's jealousy, but the gods' collective discomfort that ensured the twin would be forgotten. And so the forgetting spread. Scribes left him out of genealogies. Orators glossed over his existence. Children were taught that Leto gave birth to a single shining sun. The myths were rewritten. The silences filled with noise. Where there had once been two, there was now only one. But silence has its own memory. The ocean remembered him. It remembered his bare feet on its shores, his breath sinking with its tides, his gaze that reached into its deepest trenches, and it carried him in currents and undertows, in whispers through coral reefs and through the long songs of whales. Fishermen spoke of strange dreams. Shipwreck survivors claimed to have been rescued not by gods or chance, but by a feeling, a calm presence in the water that told them to let go of fear. On certain moonless nights, when the waves are low and the wind is still, some say you can hear a different kind of music if you press your ear to the earth. Not Apollo's lyre, not the roar of Poseidon's storms, but something quieter, older, a single note repeating endlessly, like the sound of a heart too deep to reach. That is where he lives now, not in temples, but in the moments between memory and forgetting, not in story, but in feeling, in the hush before sleep, in the strange calm before a storm, in the part of you that knows without reason that something vast and sacred is watching. He was not erased, he simply let himself drift beyond the reach of names. And the world, dazzled by the sun, never noticed that it had turned its back on the sea. In the shifting tapestry of old myths and ocean winds, there is one tale that has survived among Sowas, quietly, like a piece of driftwood, clinging to the tide. A story told only by sea wives, whispered between the lullabies of sailors' children, and sung in wordless hums by the women who stand barefoot in the surf, waiting for their husbands to return. It is the tale of a goddess who wept, not for herself, but for a child not her own, a child she recognized though the world did not. They say it happened one dusky evening, when the sun had dipped just low enough to cast a pale silver glow across the waters. The silent twin, then still a boy, stood on the edge of Delos as he often did, gazing into the horizon. But this time he was not alone. She emerged not from thunder or fire, not in a chariot pulled by sea beasts or trailing coral and crown. She came quietly, rising from the waves as though she had always been there, part of the ocean itself. Her form shimmered like moonlight caught in the foam, her eyes deep and unknowable. Some call her Thetis, mother of Achilles. Others name her Amphitrite, wife of Poseidon. Still others claim she was none of these, that she was older, nameless, a forgotten daughter of the sea who once guided lost souls back to their beginning. She did not speak, not at first. She only watched him, the boy without a name, as he stood barefoot in the tide, unmoving, his eyes searching a distance no one else could see. And then the goddess began to weep. It was not sorrow that broke her, it was recognition, for she saw in him the same silence she carried in her bones, the deep, wordless grief of all things forgotten. She knew what it meant to be passed over in songs, to be overshadowed by louder gods, to exist only in the spaces between verses, and she understood in the marrow of her being that this child was not a prince of Olympus. He was not meant for glory, nor for war, nor for worship. He was meant for return. Legends claim she knelt beside him, her hand hovering just above his shoulder, afraid to touch what felt like a memory returned to flesh. The sea pulsed softly around them, and the boy turned his head, slowly, calmly. Their eyes met, and in that gaze there passed between them a language older than sound. She did not ask his name, he did not ask hers, there was no need. In some versions of the tale she spoke, only once, a single phrase carried away by the wind before it could be recorded. In others she sang a song without words, and the fish came close to listen. But in all tellings she did one thing the same. She cried for him. Not because he was sad, not because he was broken, but because she saw in him the unbearable beauty of something destined to vanish, a tide that would rise only to retreat, a god who would never be crowned, and yet who held in his silence more depth than any throne could measure. After that day she returned often, sometimes as a wave that curled around his ankles, sometimes as mist that wrapped around his shoulders, sometimes as a dolphin that swam alongside him when he entered the water. And though they were never seen speaking, the boy grew quieter still, as though he had found a companion who understood the weight he carried. There were rumours among the island folk. Some said the goddess had claimed him, that she had adopted him in secret, hiding him from the gods who feared what they could not name. Others said she had offered him a place in the sea, a realm where names were not needed, where silence was power, and where no one was ever forgotten, only transformed. There are even wilder stories, of her taking him deep beneath the ocean, where the walls are made of blue crystal, and time does not flow in a straight line, where memory pools like water, and every lost voice is kept safe in a coral vault. In those tales, he did not vanish. He descended, willingly, into the realm where forgotten things still live. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. After the goddess began to appear, the twin was seen less and less. He wandered farther from the temples, stayed longer by the sea. Sometimes he would be gone for days. When he returned, his skin was cool, his hair damp, his eyes distant. He carried with him the smell of salt and storms, and his silence grew deeper, no longer empty, but full of something no one else could hear. Leto noticed the change. She said nothing, but her heart ached with a quiet ache, a mother's ache, knowing her child was still near, and yet already beginning to leave. She once watched as he walked into the surf up to his chest, paused, and then turned to look back, just once, as if asking her something, as if saying goodbye. She nodded, and he turned back toward the sea, and the goddess wept again. Even now, some say her tears fall in secret, hidden in the sea spray, on days when the ocean is too calm to be natural. They say she mourns not his loss, but the world's failure to recognize him. They say she watches over those who are forgotten, the quiet children, the gentle wanderers, the ones who do not fit the stories we tell, but who carry a truth far deeper. She is the goddess who wept, not for glory, not for tragedy, but for the unbearable beauty of a soul too quiet to be heard, and yet too powerful to be ignored. And in every tear she sheds, his name is remembered, not the name the world never gave him, but the one whispered only in the deepest part of the sea. It happened on a night unlike any other. There was no moon, so not even a sliver, and the sky stretched overhead like a vast black curtain, stitched faintly with stars. The island of Delos was silent, its temples asleep, its altars dim. Even the wind had gone still, as though holding its breath. The sea was as flat as obsidian, and the waves, which usually whispered against the shore like old friends sharing secrets, had retreated into an uncanny hush. And in this silence he walked. The forgotten twin, now no longer a boy, but something older, though still ageless, stepped barefoot across the cool stones of the island, leaving no prints, as though the ground itself refused to record his passing. He did not carry a torch. He did not need one. The darkness welcomed him, embraced him, parted before him like a familiar veil. Those who might have seen him that night, and there are few who claim they did, said that his eyes glowed faintly, not with fire or divinity, but with reflection, as if the stars themselves had chosen to hide inside them. He walked without hurry, without fear, Not like someone fleeing from the world, but like someone returning to it. The sea waited. The shoreline, usually full of life and emotion, now looked like the threshold to another realm, smooth, infinite, and impossibly still. He stood at its edge for a long time, not moving, not speaking. Some say he was listening to something. Others say he was waiting for someone. A final sign, a farewell. Behind him the world lay heavy with forgetting. His name had been removed from the scrolls, his place erased from the myths. His voice had never been heard in song, but none of that mattered. He had never belonged to Olympus, he had never wanted to. He was a god of no temples, a soul of no title, a presence without a history. But the sea had remembered him, always, and now it called him home. Without hesitation he stepped forward. The water did not rush to meet him, did not crash or swirl. It simply opened, calmly, like a door inviting him in. With each step the tide rose to greet him, first at his ankles, then his knees, then his waist, and still he did not look back, not once. He moved as one who has already said all his goodbyes. Some myths say the water glowed faintly as he walked deeper, a bioluminescent path marked by soft blues and greens, as if the sea was honouring its child with a gentle procession. Others claim that dolphins surfaced nearby in silent watchfulness, their eyes shining with something close to recognition, or grief. And then he was gone. He did not dive, nor sink, nor swim. He simply continued walking until the ocean took him entirely, not swallowed, not claimed, but embraced, as though it had been waiting all this time to welcome him back to where he had come from. No great storm followed, no wailing of the gods, no earthquakes or thunder or signs in the sky. The heavens remained silent, the stars watching. The sea folded back into itself, untroubled, as if nothing had happened at all. But something had. The next morning the island felt different. The air was heavier. The light fell strangely on the marble. The birds did not sing. And though no one could quite say why, a deep sense of absence settled across Delos like morning mist. Leto knew. She did not ask. She felt it in her bones. The tide had pulled something sacred away, and in its place was only silence, the same silence she had known on the day of his birth. Priests carried on with their rituals. Worshippers lit candles to Apollo and sang praises to his golden light. No one mentioned the other. They had long stopped doing so. His name had faded from language, replaced by nothing at all. But in quiet moments by the water some felt it. A pause in the wind, a rhythm beneath the waves, a sense that someone else was still there, watching, listening, remembering. They say he did not drown, for drowning belongs to mortals, nor did he die, for death does not touch those born of gods. What happened that night was something different, something older than language. He did not leave the world. He became something else, a current, a murmur, a deep intelligence beneath the waves. Not a god in the way we understand gods, with worship and symbols and prayers, but a presence, a guardian of forgotten things, of skate, of stillness, of everything that lies beneath what we can name. And though no one speaks his name now, though no one builds altars in his honour, he is not gone. He is in the lull before a storm, in the pressure you feel just before diving into deep water, in the eerie calm of an ocean night, in the voice that says nothing, but which somehow makes you stop and listen. He walked into the sea, not to vanish, but to become the part of the world that does not need to be seen, to be known. They began as whispers, soft and uncertain and spoken by weathered sailors and old islanders who had spent their lives beside the sea. At first they were dismissed as nothing more than tired stories told by men who'd spent too many years adrift, who mistook the groan of shipwood or the sigh of wind in the sails for something more. But over time the whispers became harder to ignore. It started with the songs, not songs in the way mortals know them, not melodies carried on instruments, nor ballads sung in taverns or temples. These were different, ancient and strange, sounds that didn't belong to birds or whales or any beast that swam. They came from the depths, far below where light dares to travel, and they rose with the tide like forgotten memories trying to break the surface. Fishermen were the first to notice. They would be out at sea, far from shore, the sky stretched wide and black above them, And then, faintly just beneath the creak of the boat and the slap of water against hull, they'd hear it. A hum, a tone, a vibration that seemed to come not from the air, but from the water itself, as though the sea had begun to sing. Not loud, not piercing, gentle, almost like it was calling. Some said it was like the low, sorrowful note of a bowed instrument. Others claimed it sounded like many voices singing as one. A chorus made of tides and memory, of loss and peace. But all agreed on one thing: it wasn't natural. Not in the way we use the word. It was something else, something older. And stranger still, those who heard it were changed. One man, a grizzled fisherman who had sailed for nearly 50 years, heard the song during a long, lonely night adrift. His nets were empty, his lanterns low. He had been ready to give up, ready to drift wherever the current carried him. But then the sound came, a soft tone rising from below. No words, just vibration, as if the sea itself were breathing. He closed his eyes, not from fear but from a strange peace, and when he opened them again, the dawn had come, and his boat was full of fish, every net overflowing. He never heard the song again. But every night after, before casting off, he'd lower a small bowl of olive oil into the water, murmuring thanks to no god in particular. There are stories of others. A woman who had lost her son to the waves and came to the shore each morning to grieve. One morning, she claimed, the water began to pulse with a rhythm, soft as a heartbeat. She said she felt a presence wrap around her like a tide, warm and unspoken. It was like the sea remembered me, she said, like it carried my sorrow, and for one moment I was not alone. The priests of Apollo denied these tales. They said there were no songs beneath the sea, only echoes of madness. Do not trust the silence, they warned. Do not listen to the darkness. But still the rumours spread, and more people began to believe that something or someone still lingered in the depths. Those who dared to listen closely swore the sound was more than a song. It was a language, though not one made of words. It did not speak to the ears but to the body, to the soul. It reached into your memories, into your hidden grief, your buried dreams. It drew out the pieces of yourself you thought were lost and cradled them in its gentle sound. And in that sound some claimed they felt a presence, not frightening, not divine in the way of thunderbolts or golden crowns, but intimate. A watcher, a listener, a god perhaps, though not like the others. A being that did not ask for worship or praise. One that simply existed, deep below, holding the forgotten things. Many came to believe that this was where the silent twin had gone, that he had not disappeared, but transformed, or perhaps awakened, that he had become the very song they heard, the deep resonance that moved through the currents like a tide of memory, a god not of temples or prophecy, but of feeling, of psalmen made sacred. One philosopher, long exiled from the mainland for heresy, wrote a forbidden treatise titled The Voice That Has No Mouth. In it she claimed that the twin had become a guardian of what mortals and gods alike discard, their lost thoughts, abandoned dreams, unloved selves. He is the sea's soul, she wrote, the one who remembers when all else forgets. She was drowned for this, but her words were copied, and hidden, and read. There are still those who believe, quiet cults of no name, who gather not in temples but on cliff edges and sea caves, listening, waiting, humming, believing that the music of the deep is not just a sign of his presence, but a sign that he is still Vuostanen, to them, to all of us. That when the world grows too loud and the heart too heavy, he is there beneath it all, singing the truth that cannot be spoken. And when you are alone, truly alone, standing at the edge of the sea with tears that have no name, and thoughts you cannot explain, if you hear something soft and strange beneath the wind, do not be afraid. He is still there, the one who was never named, still listening, still singing. There is an old tale, buried deep in the neglected corners of ancient libraries and carved faintly into the crumbling stones of coastal ruins, that tells of Apollo standing at the edge of the sea, alone, quiet and no longer radiant. It is a strange story, rarely told and even more rarely believed. For Apollo is not a god of regret. He is the god of certainty, of truth, of perfection. His footsteps are light, his words absolute, his arrows strike without error, and his prophecies are never wrong. The idea that such a god could feel sorrow or even more unthinkable guilt was heresy to those who worshipped him in golden temples and sunlit groves. But the sea does not lie, And the waves have long memories. They say that on certain days when the sky is overcast and the light of the sun is veiled by clouds, Apollo leaves his throne and walks alone to the shore. He does not bring his lyre. He does not wear his golden crown. He comes as he was before the stories, before the songs, before the temples, before the sun was his to command. He comes as a brother. The sand does not sing beneath his feet. The birds do not call. The sea does not greet him with its usual whisper. He stands, silent, the hem of his tunic catching in the wind, and looks out across the water, not toward the horizon, but downward, into the depths. And those who have glimpsed him at such moments say his face is changed. The sharpness of prophecy dulls. The pride of divinity softens. His eyes are not distant with vision, but heavy with memory. He does not cry, gods rarely do, but his stillness speaks of something heavier than tears. He is remembering. He is remembering the boy who once stood beside him, not in his shadow nor in his light, but beside him. The boy who did not laugh, who did not speak, who did not ask to be seen. The boy who watched the waves as if they were speaking in a language older than Olympus itself. The boy who listened when everyone else was trying to be heard. And Apollo in the sacred quiet of the shore begins to wonder, did I drive him away? Not by force, but by forgetting. Not by cruelty, but by indifference. He remembers how the priests spoke only of him, how the poets sang only of his triumphs, how the world called his name while the other remained unnamed. How even as a child he basked in admiration, while his twin sat alone in the shallows, tracing invisible patterns in the sand. He remembers the questions he never asked, the silences he never entered, the presence he never truly acknowledged. And worst of all, he remembers how easy it was to let him go. There had been no ceremony, no farewell, just the slow unravelling of presence, the gradual fading of a shadow that had never demanded to be seen. And then one night he was gone, walking into the sea without a sound as if he had been nothing more than a passing mist. But he was not nothing, he was something Apollo cannot name, a depth that he cannot measure, a silence that no prophecy can pierce, and so Apollo stands at the water's edge, a god who cannot be wounded, yet who carries a wound. Some say that he speaks aloud in those moments, softly, as if speaking not to the sea but to the memory beneath it, words that have never been recorded, and perhaps never will be. Others claim he plays a single note on an invisible lyre, a tone so sorrowful, so raw that the waves hesitate before crashing. There are legends that the sea responds, that it rises slightly as if reaching for him, that a wind curls around his ankles and whispers something only he can hear, that, just once, he smiled, sadly knowingly, and nodded, as if to say, I understand now, as if to say, I see you. But then the clouds shift, the sky brightens, the sun reclaims its throne, and Apollo, god of light, resumes his place. He returns to the temples, to the hymns, to the golden chariot that carries him across the sky. Yet something in him is changed. He speaks less of certainties. His music, once triumphant and flawless, now carries undercurrents of longing. He avoids the sea for weeks at a time, and when he does return, he does so with reverence, because he knows now what he did not know then, that there are truths deeper than prophecy, and presences more enduring than glory. He knows that while he rose in the sky, his brother fell into the sea, not as a failure, not as a retreat, but as a becoming. He knows that somewhere beneath the waves the other twin still listens, and he knows, perhaps too late, that even gods can forget the ones who mattered most. But the sea does not forget, and neither does he. There was a time, long before the temples of Apollo gleamed in marble brilliance, and long before the myths were fixed in scrolls and stone, when small altars stood near the sea, built not to the god of light, but to someone else, someone whose name is now lost, someone who stood beside Apollo at birth but disappeared from his stories like a breath caught in the wind. They were modest structures, simple stones stacked with care, adorned with sea glass, driftwood, and shells smoothed by time. There were no grand statues, no golden offerings, no elaborate hymns written in his name. But the people who built them came often. They brought gifts of silence, moments of prayer without words, and listened to the waves as if expecting a response. These people were not priests or rulers. They were fishermen, healers, weavers, and dreamers. They claimed to feel something by the water, something that wasn't Apollo's warmth, but another presence entirely, softer, deeper, colder yet strangely comforting. They said it was the feeling of being known, not for what you achieve, but simply for what you carry. And they believed this presence had once walked among them, had once been born like Apollo, but had chosen the ocean over the sky, not out of weakness, but because it sang a truer song. And so they honoured him, not loudly, not publicly, but in their own quiet way. Small gatherings were held at twilight, when the sky turned the colour of secrets and the sea shimmered, without reflecting anything clearly. There were no speeches, only stillness, no processions, only sitting. Sometimes they sang, but not with words, just humming in long, low tones that matched the rhythm of the tide. The goal was not to summon, but to remember, not to worship, but to witness. They called him different things, none of them were official. The Nameless One, the Second Light, the Listener, the God who watches from below, the one without a temple. And for a time these altars remained, scattered across the islands and coastal villages, as reminders that not all divinity shines. But then the forgetting came. It began with Apollo's ascent. As his worship spread, so too did the need for singularity. The stories needed focus. The poets wanted clarity and ambiguity, especially of divine siblings who did not speak, did not act, did not compete, became a threat to the shape of the myth. So the scribes erased him, not with malice, but with polish. They cleaned the narratives like stones rubbed smooth in a river, removing the rough edges and uncertain shadows. A twin who walked into the sea? Who said nothing? Who asked for nothing? What place could there be for such a figure in the hymns of empire? The quiet altars were deemed superstitious, primitive, heretical even. Priests were sent to dismantle them. The stones were thrown back into the ocean. The sea glass was discarded. The driftwood burned. The people who remembered him stopped speaking his name, if they ever knew it at all. Some were punished for clinging to the old rituals. Others simply fell silent, not from fear but from heartbreak. Because how does one explain to the world that the God you love never asked to be remembered? And so the cult of the twin faded, slowly, softly, but like mist. The last known reference appears in the margins of a sailor's diary, hundreds of years after the great temples of Apollo reached their zenith. The sailor describes a dream he had while lost at sea. A boy stood on the water, not speaking, just watching. Behind him, the stars blinked in strange patterns, and the ocean breathed in time with his heart. The sailor writes, "I woke with tears, though I do not know why. I think he was real. I think we forgot him." Today, archaeologists sometimes find odd arrangements of stones near ancient shorelines, structures that don't match any known temple design. Most are catalogued as natural formations or pre-Hellenic debris. But a few have wondered. A few have noticed that these ruins are always near the water and always positioned toward the horizon, not toward Olympus. Some have even felt it, that strange stillness, that sense of presence, as if the forgotten God is still there, waiting, not for recognition, but for the world to grow quiet enough to feel him again. Because the cult may have vanished, the altars destroyed, the stories erased, but memory is not so easily buried. It lingers in the rhythm of the tide, in the pause before a wave crashes, in the hush that falls when you stand alone by the sea and suddenly feel seen. The world may have forgotten the twin, but the sea has not, and somewhere in the deep places where no prayer has reached for centuries, the presence of the lost God still waits. Not angry, not grieving, just listening to, the way he always did, for someone to remember that he was once loved in silence. There are places in the world where the sea is unnaturally calm, not because the winds are gentle or the moon is kind, but because something in the water is watching. These are the places mariners avoid without knowing why, where children fall quiet without being told, and where even the birds circle wide, reluctant to cross directly overhead. These are the places where he is said to dwell, not as a man, not even as a god in the sense Olympus would recognize, but as something older, something beneath. The stories are rare, hidden in the deep pockets of coastal lore, tales traded in low voices over firelight, often accompanied by a glance toward the darkened waves. In these stories, the twin did not disappear. He did not perish, nor fade entirely into myth. He became something else, something the sea had not seen before but had long awaited. The sea does not forget what it loves. It remembers every shipwreck, every sacrifice, every prayer whispered through tears. It remembers the gods who cursed it, the mortals who feared it, and the offerings cast into its depths with trembling hands. It remembers, most of all, those who listened. And so, when this silent twin walked into its arms, the sea did not claim him as it had claimed others. It did not drag him down in anger or hunger. It opened, it received, it welcomed, and in doing so it gave him a new shape. Some say he became the soul of the ocean itself, its memory, its breath, its silence, that he is now the one who moves beneath the currents where no light reaches, where forgotten things gather like sediment on the ocean floor. Not dead, not gone, but changed. His form no longer fixed, his face no longer human, but his presence unmistakable to those who have felt it. Sailors speak of this presence in strange ways, not as a god to worship, but as a being to respect. They say that when storms come too quickly, or the fog refuses to lift, it is because something beneath has stirred, and not in anger, but in mourning. That he grieves not for himself, but for the world above, for all the noise and blindness, for all the things lost and never looked for again. There are moments, fleeting quiet moments, when he rises, not to the surface, but near enough to be felt. These moments often occur in solitude. A woman weeping at the edge of a dock, a man watching the sea after burying a loved one, a child walking alone by the shore, unsure of who they are or where they belong. In these moments the air shifts, the wind calms, the waves pull back just slightly, as if making room for something unseen. And those who stand there long enough, those who do not turn away, they feel it. A gaze, not heavy, not piercing, but deep. A watching that does not judge or explain, but simply sees. It is the feeling of being fully known in the raw, secret place inside yourself, not for what you've done or what you will become, but for what you are when everything else is stripped away. Some describe it as peace. Others say it brings them to tears for reasons they cannot name. A few report hearing something, a soft tone, a breath, a hum, the echo of a presence who has no voice, yet speaks louder than any word ever could. The old fishermen know better than to speak of him directly. Instead, they carve small symbols into the hulls of their boats, curved lines meant to resemble waves, or sometimes just a single unbroken circle. Not for protection, they say, but for recognition. So he knows, they whisper, that we remember. And in some rare instances, those who have truly felt him, who have stood at the edge of despair and been held by the presence in the deep, return changed. They speak less, they listen more, they begin to treat an utterance not as an absence, but as something alive. They walk differently, slower, as if aware of the unseen rhythms beneath their feet. They leave offerings at the shore, not to any god of Olympus, but to the space between stories, because they understand now that divinity is not always loud, does not always demand temples or incense. Sometimes it lives in the refusal to be seen, in the dignity of silence, in the gentle gravity of a gaze that needs no praise. The twin who vanished did not seek glory, he did not raise his voice, he simply returned to the place that always called to him, the place where the gods did not rule, where the myths did not reach, where presence itself was enough. He became the sea's secret, and in that secret he found eternity, not in the heavens, but beneath. Perhaps the most mysterious part of all is that despite everything, the silence, the vanishing, the erasure from myth and memory, he is not truly gone, not entirely, not to those who are still enough to feel him. For in the quietest corners of the world, where waves brush lonely shores and the stars seem to hold their breath, his presence can still be felt. Not as a figure, not as a face, but as something far more intimate, as a presence within. There are people, quiet people, often overlooked, who walk through life with a sense of something unspoken, as if a part of them belongs to the ocean, though they've never lived by it. These are the ones who hesitate before speaking, who feel the pain of others without knowing their stories, who sit by windows during storms not to escape the rain, but to listen to it. They often cannot explain their sadness, nor their calm. They are not easily swayed by praise or reputation. They carry with them a sense of distance not out of arrogance, but because some part of them remembers what cannot be named. They are not followers of any cult. They do not wear robes or chant verses, but in their bones they carry the memory of a god the world has forgotten, a god who did not ascend into glory but sank into silence. Some say that in dreams he returns, not in the form of a man, but in images that leave no footprints in the mind. A boy walking into the sea, a pair of pale eyes beneath the surface, a melody with no source, a hand reaching upward through the water, not for help but for understanding. The people who wake from these dreams often do not speak of them. They keep them close, tucked behind the ribs like a hidden relic, and too precious and too strange to describe. And it is not only dreams. Sometimes when a person stands at the edge of a decision, when they are on the verge of change or collapse, they feel something balls, a nudge, a pause, an awareness that they are being witnessed, even if they are entirely alone. It is not comforting in the usual sense. It does not take away the pain, but it brings stillness. A kind of invisible hand upon the shoulder, a gaze that says without words, I know. Not, I will save you, not, you will be fine, but simply, you are not alone. This, they say, is his true legacy. Not a temple of stone, but a presence carried forward in those rare souls who feel the call of the sea not as adventure, but as return. Those who are not searching for meaning, but for a place where they do not have to be anything more than what they are. He does not guide armies, bless kings, or punish the wicked. His gift is gentler, the gift of being seen in silence, of being accepted without needing to speak, perform, or shine. There are even those who believe that he chooses such people not to follow him, for he demands no following, but to carry him, in their dreams, in their loneliness, in the way they hold space for others. They are the quiet ones, the listeners, the watchers, and whether they know it or not, they are the living embers of the twin who disappeared. The gods of Olympus rose to power on thunder and glory. They made themselves known through fire, conquest, and the glittering allure of perfection. But the sea, as always, chose a different way. It chose to remember what the world tried to forget. It chose to make a god not of light, but of depth, not of prophecy, but of presence, not of triumph, but of truth. And that truth is this, that not everything divine needs a name. Not every sacred thing must be visible. Some gods do not rise into the sky. They fall into the soul quietly, like a tide that fills the empty spaces. He is still there, not in the pages of myth, not in the voices of the priests, but in the hollow pause between one breath and the next. In the silence that lingers after grief and the strange calm that follows surrender. In the feeling you get when you're standing at the shore with nothing left to hold and the wind suddenly stops, just long enough for you to realize that something has always been listening and that it has never left.